Number 1. Dr. Josef Mengele. In the landscape of human memory, there are names that have become synonymous with evil. But when that evil wears the white coat of a healer, it ascends to a unique level of terror. This is the story of a man who did not just betray his oath to do no harm. He actively sought out the one place on earth where he could inflict the maximum possible harm, all under the guise of science. He was a man with 2 doctorates, a man of wealth and charisma who, in the very center of a death factory, was given a chilling nickname by the inmates. They called him the Angel of Death. This is the story of Dr. Josef Mengele. Born in 1911 to a powerful industrial family in Germany, Josef Mengele was the picture of success. He was brilliant, ambitious, and handsome. He studied at the finest universities, earning a PhD in anthropology and an MD in medicine. He was a published researcher, a man at the forefront of the new, exciting, and terrifying field of eugenics. He was a fervent believer in the Nazi ideology of a master race, and he was obsessed with the idea of unlocking the secrets of human heredity. When World War II began, he served as a decorated medical officer with the SS on the Eastern Front, winning the Iron Cross for bravery. After being wounded, he was deemed unfit for combat. He could have taken any number of safe, prestigious research jobs in Berlin, but Mengele didn't want a desk. He wanted a laboratory unlike any other in the world, and in May 1943, he willingly, eagerly, requested a transfer to the most infamous place on earth, the Auschwitz-Birkenau extermination camp. He arrived at Auschwitz not as a reluctant soldier, but as a man who had found his true calling. He was immediately given the position of chief physician for the Gypsy camp, and later, the Birkenau camp itself. His most public and most notorious duty was performing selections on the Rampe, the train platform where hundreds of thousands of victims, mostly Jews, arrived in filth-ridden cattle cars. Survivors described the scene as a vision from hell. The screaming, the dogs, the chaos. And in the middle of it all stood Dr. Mengele, impeccably dressed in a pristine white coat, his boots polished, often smiling or whistling an opera tune. As the terrified families were herded out, he would stand with an air of total, casual authority. With a simple flick of his gloved hand, he would point. Left. Right. One direction meant immediate death in the gas chambers. The other meant a temporary reprieve as a slave laborer to be worked to death. He decided the fate of tens of thousands of families, sending children one way and their mothers another, with the bored detachment of a farmer sorting livestock. But this administrative duty, this act of playing God over the masses, wasn't his passion. It was just his day job. His real work, his dark obsession, was waiting for him inside the camp's barracks. Mengele's true purpose at Auschwitz was research. He had been given a blank check to conduct human experimentation on a scale never before imagined. He had an endless supply of test subjects, people who had no rights, no names, and no hope of escape. His laboratory was the camp itself. His primary all-consuming obsession was with genetics, and specifically with twins. He believed twins held the key to unlocking the secrets of heredity and reproduction. He wanted to solve the mystery of how to make German women have more multiple births, to breed the master race faster. He would stand on the platform himself, scanning the lines of new arrivals, shouting, "Zwillinge! Zwillinge! Twins!" and pulling the terrified children from their mother's arms. These children were not gassed. They were Mengele's children. They were taken to a special barracks, which the inmates grimly called Mengele's Zoo. Here, they were given slightly better food and were allowed to keep their hair. Mengele would visit them, introducing himself as Uncle Mengele. He would give them candy, pat their heads, and play games with them. The children, starved for any human kindness, would run to him, chanting his name. They had no idea what Uncle Mengele was saving them for. The experiments he performed were a catalog of pseudoscientific torture, conducted with a cold, clinical curiosity, and almost always without anesthesia. He was obsessed with eye color. He would try to create blue eyes by taking dozens of children and injecting chemicals, including adrenaline and ink, directly into their eyeballs. The procedure was agonizing. It caused horrific infections, swelling, and in most cases, permanent blindness. But it never, not once, changed their eye color. He subjected the twins to hours of grueling, repetitive measurements, cataloging every inch of their bodies. Then he would move on to his surgical experiments. He would take two healthy twins and perform blood transfusions between them, just to see what would happen. He would surgically remove organs from one twin without cause. He performed unnecessary and brutal amputations. But his most common experiment was to infect one twin with a deadly disease, like typhus, and then, as that twin died a slow, agonizing death, he would meticulously chart the control twin's reaction. But his experiment wasn't complete until he had the other twin, the healthy one. When an experiment was over, or when one twin had died, Mengele could not wait for the control twin to die of natural causes. He needed to compare their internal organs. He would have the surviving healthy child brought to his lab, laid on a table, and he would personally murder them with a single, direct injection of chloroform or phenol straight into their heart. This, for him, was the final necessary step of the scientific method. He would then have both bodies sent to the autopsy table. He would spend hours dissecting them, comparing every organ, every bone. He would then harvest their organs, their eyes, and sometimes their skeletons, preserving them in jars to be shipped back to his colleagues at the prestigious Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin as valuable research specimens. His cruelty wasn't limited to twins. He collected dwarves, like the Ovitz family, subjecting them to endless humiliating examinations. He was fascinated by noma, a disease of malnutrition that causes gangrene of the face. He would find infected children, document their decay as their faces literally rotted away, and then murder them to have their heads preserved in jars. And all of it, he believed, was legitimate science. By late 1944, the war was turning. The Soviet Red Army was closing in on Auschwitz. The Nazis, in a desperate panic, began to destroy the evidence of their crimes. The gas chambers were dynamited. On January 17, 1945, just 10 days before the Soviets liberated the camp, Dr. Josef Mengele, the Angel of Death, packed his crates of research, his notes, his blood samples, his jars of human organs, and vanished. He slipped out of the camp, disguised as a regular German army officer, and fled west, disappearing into the chaos of a collapsing Germany. The most infuriating part of Mengele's story is not just his crimes, it's his escape. He was actually captured by American forces, but they had no idea who he was. He was just another POW, and after a few weeks, the Americans, overwhelmed with prisoners, simply released him. He spent the next 4 years hiding in plain sight, working as a farmhand in his home state of Bavaria. In 1949, with the help of his wealthy family and a network of Nazi sympathizers known as the Ratlines, he was given a fake passport. He boarded a ship and sailed to Argentina, a popular haven for fugitive Nazis. While his colleagues and superiors were being tried at Nuremberg and hanged for crimes against humanity, Josef Mengele was starting a new, comfortable life in Buenos Aires. For decades, he was the most wanted Nazi fugitive in the world. Mossad, the Israeli intelligence agency, hunted him relentlessly. They famously captured his colleague Adolf Eichmann, but Mengele was always one step ahead. He fled from Argentina to Paraguay and finally to Brazil, where he lived under the protection of a community of supporters. He was never arrested. He was never forced to stand in a courtroom. He was never made to confront the survivors he had tortured. On February 7, 1979, at the age of 67, Josef Mengele went for a swim off a Brazilian coast, suffered a massive stroke in the water, and drowned. He died a free man, his evil unpunished. But what is truly terrifying is that he was not alone. As Mengele performed his horrors in Europe, another doctor in another empire was running a facility that made Auschwitz look like a small-time operation, a factory of death built to weaponize plagues, run by a man named Shiro Ishii. Number 2. Dr. Shiro Ishii. The name Josef Mengele has become the ultimate symbol of medical evil, a doctor who turned a death camp into his personal laboratory. But what is truly terrifying is that he was not alone. Halfway across the world, in a remote corner of occupied China, another empire was conducting research so vast, so organized, and so profoundly evil that it made Mengele's personal experiments look like the work of an amateur. This is the story of a secret city built for the sole purpose of weaponizing disease, a factory of death where doctors, not soldiers, were the chief executioners. It was a place where human beings were not called prisoners. They were called maruta, the Japanese word for logs of wood. And it was all run by a man whose ambition and cruelty were matched only by his scientific brilliance. This is the story of Unit 731, and its demonic founder, Dr. Shiro Ishii. Born in 1892, Shiro Ishii was a man destined for the elite. He graduated from the Kyoto Imperial University's medical school. A brilliant, arrogant, and fiercely nationalistic man, Ishii was a microbiologist, and he had a singular, terrifying vision. He believed that the future of warfare would not be fought with bullets and bombs, but with plagues and pestilence. He saw biological warfare as the ultimate weapon, cheap, silent, and capable of eliminating entire populations. He tirelessly lobbied the Japanese High Command, promoting his vision. While others saw germs as a medical problem, Ishii saw them as an industrial opportunity. His superiors were so impressed by his fanaticism and his cold logic that in the 1930s, when Japan invaded and occupied Manchuria, they gave him a blank check. They gave him a vast, isolated territory near the city of Harbin and told him to make his vision a reality. The facility he built was a sprawling, state-of-the-art complex hidden deep in the Chinese countryside. Its official name was the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department. This was a lie, a cover story to mask its true purpose. Its real name was Unit 731. This was not just a camp. It was a city of science, complete with its own airfield, railway, factories, and dungeons, all dedicated to a single task: the mass production of weaponized diseases and the use of live human subjects to test them. Ishii and his team of Japan's brightest doctors and scientists rounded up thousands of prisoners. These were not just soldiers. They were local Chinese civilians, men, women, and children. They were also Russian, Korean, and Allied prisoners of war. These people, once they entered the gates of Unit 731, ceased to be human. They became maruta, logs of wood, delivered to the facility to be cut up, infected, and burned. Inside the labs of Unit 731, every conceivable horror was carried out in the name of medical research. Ishii's primary goal was to find the most lethal strains of diseases like bubonic plague, anthrax, and cholera. To do this, he needed to test them. He would have prisoners lined up and injected with different strains. He would then observe them, meticulously taking notes, as they succumbed to raging fevers, agonizing pain, and uncontrollable sickness. But this wasn't enough for him. He needed to see what the disease did to their internal organs. He couldn't wait for them to die, as the process of death would degrade the organs. So Dr. Ishii and his surgeons pioneered the practice of vivisection, the dissection of a living human being. They would take an infected prisoner, strap them to a surgical table, fully conscious without a drop of anesthesia, and cut them open. They would remove their organs, one by one, while the prisoner was still alive and screaming, just to observe the effects of the disease in real time. This was considered standard procedure, but the depravity of Shiro Ishii's research went far beyond just disease. He was obsessed with the limits of human endurance. He would subject prisoners to experiments that sound like they were pulled from a torture manual. To test the effects of frostbite, they would take prisoners outside in the dead of the Manchurian winter, when temperatures plunged to 40 degrees below zero. They would force them to dip their arms and legs in vats of cold water until they were frozen solid. A guard would then strike the limbs with a cane, and they would shatter like glass. The doctors would then experiment with different thawing methods, sometimes pouring scalding hot water on the frozen limbs, which would cause the flesh to boil and peel away from the bone, often while the victim was still alive. They would strap prisoners to stakes and test new weapons on them, from flamethrowers to chemical bombs, just to study the blast patterns on living flesh. They placed victims inside high-pressure chambers, slowly increasing the pressure until their eyes burst from their sockets. They spun people to death in giant centrifuges. They injected horse blood into human subjects to see what would happen. They surgically removed a prisoner's stomach and reattached their esophagus directly to their intestines. They amputated limbs and tried to reattach them to the opposite side of the body. They would hang prisoners upside down to see how long it took for them to choke to death. All of this was meticulously documented, photographed, and filed away as valuable medical data. But Ishii's work wasn't just confined to the laboratory. He was eager to test his products in the real world, and he had the entirety of China as his testing ground. Ishii's field tests were acts of mass terrorism. Unit 731's airplanes would fly over Chinese cities and drop specially designed bombs. These were not explosive bombs. They were plague bombs, ceramic casings filled with fleas that had been fed on plague-infected rats. These fleas would rain down on the civilian population, starting catastrophic bubonic plague outbreaks that killed hundreds of thousands of people. His agents would walk into villages and contaminate their wells with cholera and typhoid. They handed out poisoned food and candy to children. Shiro Ishii was not just a doctor. He was a mass murderer on an industrial scale. It is estimated that his direct experiments and his biological warfare attacks killed as many as 500,000 innocent people. But as the war came to an end in 1945 and the Soviet army advanced into Manchuria, Ishii knew the game was over. He ordered the facility dynamited, every remaining prisoner murdered, and his staff sworn to secrecy. He fled back to Japan, a war criminal responsible for 500,000 deaths. He was captured by the Americans, but he had one last card to play. In one of the most cynical deals in military history, the United States government made a trade. Shiro Ishii offered the Americans all of his research, all the notes, the slides, the autopsy reports from his 10-plus years of human experimentation, a trove of data that the West could never hope to obtain legally. In exchange, he asked for one thing: full immunity from prosecution for himself and for every doctor on his staff. The deal was struck. While his Nazi counterparts were being executed, Shiro Ishii was put on the American payroll, debriefed for his scientific knowledge, and then quietly released. He was never charged with a single crime. He never spent a day in jail. He lived out the rest of his life in peace in Japan, dying of cancer in 1959. His story is the ultimate example of evil rewarded. But while Ishii and Mengele built their empires of death, other doctors in the Nazi regime were focused on a more specialized, intimate kind of cruelty, a mission to destroy the future of entire races at their very source. Number 3. Dr. Karl Clauberg. The horrors of Auschwitz were not the work of one man. While Josef Mengele was conducting his sadistic research on twins, other doctors were using the camp as their own personal laboratory, each driven by their own dark obsessions. Mengele was a sadist, but he was also a showman. His colleague, however, was a different kind of monster. He was not a charismatic angel of death. He was a quiet, methodical, and obsessive gynecologist. He was a man singularly focused on one goal: to find a cheap, fast, and non-surgical way to sterilize millions of women, to wipe out entire races from the face of the earth without them even knowing it. He was a man who, in the name of science, turned the very source of human life into a chamber of torture. This is the story of Dr. Karl Clauberg. Born in 1898, Karl Clauberg was a respected and prominent figure in the German medical establishment. He was a chief physician, a professor of gynecology, and a man who had made a legitimate career in fertility research. But like so many others, his science was corrupted by Nazi ideology. He was a high-ranking member of the SS and a fanatical believer in their mission to purify the human race. In 1942, as the final solution was being put into motion, Clauberg saw an opportunity. He wrote a personal letter to Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the Holocaust, with a chilling proposal. He argued that gassing millions of Jews was inefficient and wasteful. He proposed a better way, a medical method to permanently sterilize undesirable women on a mass scale, so they could be kept alive as a disposable slave labor force, unable to ever bear children. Himmler was intrigued. He gave Clauberg his full blessing, and in December 1942, transferred him to the one place where he could conduct his human experiments without any rules or ethical boundaries: Auschwitz. He was given his own dedicated laboratory inside the infamous Block 10. This building was a house of horrors unlike any other. It was a barrack filled with hundreds of Jewish and Romani women, prisoners who were selected specifically for Clauberg's experiments. These women were kept like lab rats, fed just enough to keep them alive, their bodies reserved for the exclusive, brutal use of the doctor and his staff. While other prisoners were gassed or worked to death, these women lived in a state of permanent terror, knowing that at any moment they would be called for their next treatment. Clauberg's method was a grotesque perversion of his medical specialty. He was looking for a way to block the fallopian tubes without using a knife. To do this, he developed a caustic acidic liquid, a blend of formaldehyde and other toxic chemicals. He would have a woman strapped to a gynecological chair, often in front of a room full of other doctors, and without any anesthesia, he would inject this acidic poison directly into her uterus. The women screamed in agonizing pain, a pain so intense that many passed out. The acid would burn its way through their reproductive organs, causing massive inflammation, internal bleeding, and unimaginable suffering. He would repeat this procedure over and over, refining his mixture, testing different dosages, observing his victims' reactions with the cold detachment of a man mixing chemicals in a beaker. The immediate goal was to create so much scar tissue that the fallopian tubes would be permanently sealed. The pain was just the beginning. The injections caused horrific infections. Women would develop raging fevers, their insides ravaged by the poison. Many died on the spot from the shock and the pain. Others died days later, their bodies unable to cope with the septicemia. But to Clauberg, this was all just data. To check his work, he needed to see if the tubes were truly blocked. To do this, he would bring the women back, sometimes just days after the acid injection, and perform a second procedure. He would inject a thick, dye-like liquid into their wombs to see if it would leak. This procedure, performed on their already burned and infected organs, was, for many survivors, an even greater torture than the first. And for some, even this wasn't the end. If he suspected a woman's ovaries had been damaged, he would simply have her killed. He would have the women murdered, sometimes with the same fatal phenol injections to the heart that Mengele used, so that he could have their bodies sent to the autopsy table. There, he would dissect them, removing their organs to study the long-term effects of his acid. He kept hundreds of these specimens, a grotesque library of his success. He was so proud of his research that he bragged to Himmler in a 1943 letter, boasting that with his method, a single doctor with a small staff could sterilize several hundred to 1,000 women in a single day. He had achieved his goal. He had turned the gift of life into an assembly line procedure of death. As the Red Army advanced in 1945, Clauberg, like Mengele, fled Auschwitz. He was captured by the Soviets and sentenced to 25 years in prison, but he was released early in 1955. In an act of unbelievable arrogance, he returned to West Germany and tried to get his old job back. He boasted publicly about his scientific achievements at Auschwitz, the new sterilization method he had perfected. This time, the German public, now aware of the Holocaust, was horrified. Jewish survivor groups, hearing that this monster was free, raised the alarm. He was arrested by German authorities in 1955, but died of a heart attack in his cell in 1957, before he could ever stand trial for his specific crimes. Clauberg's story is a chilling reminder that the Nazi doctors were not all sadistic showmen like Mengele. Some, like Clauberg, were quiet, methodical, and driven by a cold, bureaucratic vision of evil, a vision of a world cleansed of its undesirables, one agonizing injection at a time. But while these men were waging war on their prisoners, another doctor was waging a war on his patients, inventing a procedure that would destroy the minds of thousands. Number 4. Dr. Radovan Karadžić. The monsters we have met so far, Mengele, Ishii, Clauberg, were men who used their medical skills to destroy the human body. They operated with scalpels, with needles, and with gas. Their evil was intimate, physical, and hands-on. But there is another kind of doctor, a doctor who specializes in the most delicate and powerful organ of all, the human mind. A psychiatrist is trained to heal trauma, to calm paranoia, and to bring people back from the brink of madness. They are the healers of the soul. But what happens when a man with this intimate knowledge of the human psyche decides not to heal, but to corrupt? This is the story of a doctor who didn't just kill patients one by one. He used his understanding of mass psychology to poison an entire nation, to ignite a genocide, and to orchestrate the slaughter of hundreds of thousands. This is the story of Dr. Radovan Karadžić, the Butcher of Bosnia. Born in 1945 in Montenegro, Radovan Karadžić was not a simple brute. He was a man of letters, a published poet, an intellectual, and a trained medical professional. He moved to the vibrant, multicultural city of Sarajevo, a city that was a shining example of ethnic harmony, where Muslims, Serbs, and Croats lived together, intermarried, and thrived. He studied medicine at the University of Sarajevo, and in 1974 he specialized in psychiatry. He worked at the main hospital in the city, treating patients struggling with anxiety, depression, and other mental illnesses. He was, by all accounts, a respected, if somewhat eccentric, figure in the city's intellectual circles. He wrote children's poetry. He was a family man. He lived and worked in the very city he would one day try to erase from the map. But beneath this poetic intellectual exterior, a dark, fanatical nationalism was growing, and he was waiting for his moment. That moment came in the early 1990s, with the violent collapse of Yugoslavia. As the old country fractured along ethnic lines, Karadžić, the psychiatrist, saw his opening. He abandoned medicine and seized political power, becoming the leader of the self-proclaimed Bosnian Serb Republic. And it was here that he weaponized his medical training. He understood fear. He understood paranoia. He understood how to manipulate a population. He went on television and radio, not just as a politician, but as a doctor to his people, diagnosing an entire nation. He told his fellow Serbs that they were under mortal threat, that their Muslim and Croat neighbors were Islamic fundamentalists and Ustaše, who were waiting to slaughter them in their beds. He used his calm medical authority to describe a disease that didn't exist, and then he offered his cure, ethnic cleansing. He was the doctor who prescribed genocide as the only way to save his people. And the final solution he unleashed would kill over 100,000. His first act as the nation's new surgeon was to amputate its capital, Sarajevo. In April 1992, his forces surrounded the city, the very city where he had studied, worked, and raised his family. For the next 1,125 days, the longest siege in the history of modern warfare, he held 500,000 civilians hostage. He, the doctor, systematically cut off their access to food, water, medicine, and electricity. But this wasn't just a medieval siege. It was a psychological one. He ordered his snipers and artillery crews to line the hills overlooking the city. They were given one simple order: shoot everything. They shot women trying to collect rainwater. They shot old men on their balconies. They shot children playing in the street or as they ran to school. The infamous Sniper Alley was his creation. The city became a living hell, a 24/7 psychological experiment in terror designed by a psychiatrist to break the human will and prove that coexistence was impossible. While Sarajevo was being starved, Karadžić's forces, under his direct command, were cleansing the countryside. They swept through towns, rounding up non-Serb populations. Men were executed. Women were taken to rape camps. Mosques and churches were dynamited. But his masterpiece of evil, the act that would forever define his legacy, came in July 1995. The town of Srebrenica, a UN-declared safe area, was crowded with 40,000 Muslim refugees, all under the protection of Dutch peacekeepers. Karadžić's army, led by his general, Ratko Mladic, overran the town. Karadžić himself was filmed entering the town, a camera crew in tow, patting a young Muslim boy on the head. He looked into the camera, this psychiatrist, this poet, and said, "We give this town to the Serb people. The time has come to take revenge on the Turks." What followed was not war. It was an industrial-scale massacre. His soldiers began to separate the families. The women and children were put on buses and deported. But the men and boys, some as young as 12, were marched into fields, schools, and warehouses. And over the next 3 days, his forces executed them. They shot them with machine guns. They killed them with grenades. In just 72 hours, Dr. Karadžić's army murdered over 8,000 men and boys, burying them in mass graves. It was the worst single act of mass murder in Europe since the Holocaust. When the war ended, the world finally saw the full scale of his crimes. The mass graves, the concentration camps, the 100,000 dead, the 2 million displaced. The International Criminal Tribunal in The Hague indicted Radovan Karadžić for genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. But the doctor had vanished. For over a decade, he was Europe's most wanted man. He was a master of disguise, using his intelligence to evade a global manhunt. He didn't hide in a bunker. He did the opposite. He created an entirely new identity. He grew a long white beard, wore thick glasses, and moved to Belgrade, the capital of Serbia. And in the most arrogant, chilling act of his life, he began practicing medicine again. He called himself Dr. Dragan Dabić, an expert in alternative medicine, a specialist in healing energy and psychology. The man who had orchestrated a genocide was now treating patients for anxiety and depression, the very conditions he had inflicted on millions. He gave public lectures. He had his own website. He hid in plain sight, his disguise as a harmless, eccentric, New Age doctor being the perfect cover. For years, he lived this double life, until 2008, when intelligence agents, acting on a tip, finally closed in. The man they arrested on a public bus was not the butcher of Bosnia, but a frail old man with a ponytail. Dr. Dragan Dabić was unmasked. Radovan Karadžić's run was over. He was extradited to The Hague, where he faced a trial that lasted for years. He was found guilty on 10 of 11 charges, including genocide, and sentenced to life in prison. Karadžić used his medical authority to commit crimes on a national scale. But while he was hiding in plain sight as a healer, another doctor across the ocean in America was also hiding. He wasn't running a war. He was running a clinic that police would later call a house of horrors. Number 5. Dr. Kermit Gosnell. The doctors we have examined so far were monsters on a truly epic scale, men who used the power of warring empires to commit genocide and crimes against humanity. Their evil was vast, systematic, and state-sponsored. But sometimes, the most profound evil is not found on a battlefield or in a concentration camp. It is found in a quiet neighborhood, on a familiar street, in a place where the desperate and the vulnerable go to seek help. This is the story of a doctor who didn't just break his oath. He shattered it with a pair of common scissors. This is the story of the Philadelphia House of Horrors, and the man who presided over its gruesome secrets for decades, Dr. Kermit Gosnell. For over 30 years, Kermit Gosnell was a pillar of his West Philadelphia community. He was one of the few doctors who had not fled the inner city. He was a licensed physician, an OB-GYN, and he presented himself as a champion of the poor, a man who would provide services to desperate, low-income, and minority women when no one else would. His clinic, the Women's Medical Society, was a place of last resort. Women came to him trusting that, despite the clinic's run-down appearance, they were in the hands of a qualified medical professional. They believed they were safe. They had no idea that the man they trusted was not just an incompetent doctor, but a cold-blooded, calculating killer. In February 2010, the FBI and the DEA, armed with a warrant, raided Kermit Gosnell's clinic. They were not there to investigate murder. They were there to bust a pill mill, investigating reports that Gosnell was selling thousands of illegal prescriptions for narcotics. But the moment they forced open the doors, the drug investigation was forgotten. The agents recoiled in horror. The smell was indescribable. It was the stench of cat urine, feces, and death. The clinic was a filthy, cluttered, blood-stained nightmare. Cat feces littered the floors and the stairs, mixed with surgical waste. The medical equipment was ancient, rusty, and broken. The recovery room was just a series of dirty recliners, stained with the blood of hundreds of women. And then they opened the freezers. Stuffed between employee lunches and frozen snacks, they found bags, bottles, and milk jugs, filled with aborted fetuses and the severed feet of infants, kept like grotesque trophies. This was not a medical facility. It was a charnel house. The horror only deepened when they found the staff. Gosnell's anesthesiologist, the person responsible for administering powerful, dangerous narcotics to patients, was a 15-year-old high school student. Other medical assistants had no training whatsoever. One was a woman he had met at a homeless shelter. These untrained employees were left to perform IV infusions, administer drugs, and even assist in surgeries. But the filth, the untrained staff, and the bags of bodies were just the first layer of evil. The agents, and later the grand jury, were about to uncover what Gosnell actually did in this house of horrors, a procedure he and his staff referred to in hushed tones as snipping. Gosnell specialized in late-term abortions, procedures that are illegal in Pennsylvania after 24 weeks. But he didn't just perform these procedures. He did them in a way that guaranteed a live birth. He would give the women labor-inducing drugs, and they would deliver the babies in the filthy clinic. These were not fetuses in the medical sense. They were viable, living, breathing infants, born at 25, 26, or even 30 weeks. According to the testimony of his own staff, these babies would squirm. They would cry. They would gasp for air. And it was at this moment that Gosnell, or his 15-year-old assistant, would step in to ensure fetal demise. When a baby was born alive, it would be taken into another room. Gosnell would flip the baby over, take a standard pair of scissors, and plunge them into the back of the infant's soft neck. He would then snip the spinal cord, severing the head from the body. This was not an abortion. This was, by every legal and medical definition, first-degree murder. And he did it hundreds, perhaps thousands of times, for decades. The infants were not his only victims. He treated the desperate women who came to him with the same level of monstrous contempt. He used unsterilized instruments, causing horrific, life-altering infections. He perforated their uteruses. He punctured their bowels. He left parts of the fetuses inside them, leading to sepsis. And in 2009, his butchery finally killed one of them. Karnamaya Mongar, a 41-year-old refugee who spoke little English, came to him for a procedure. His untrained staff administered a lethal overdose of anesthesia. As she went into cardiac arrest, Gosnell was nowhere to be found. His broken defibrillator couldn't save her. She died on his table. Gosnell simply falsified the death certificate and moved on to the next patient. The 2010 drug raid blew the case wide open. The grand jury report was one of the most horrifying documents in American legal history. In 2013, Kermit Gosnell was put on trial. He was charged with 8 counts of murder, 7 for the infants, known as Baby A through G, and 1 for Karnamaya Mongar. His defense was that he was simply performing abortions. But the testimony of his own staff, who described the snipping, the crying babies, and the severed feet in the jars, was overwhelming. The jury found him guilty of the first-degree murder of 3 of the infants and the involuntary manslaughter of Mrs. Mongar. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Gosnell's evil was physical, a bloody, filthy butchery of the body. He destroyed his victims with a pair of scissors. But as we move on, we find an evil that is, in many ways, even more chilling. A doctor who didn't need to kill the body, because he had found a way to kill the mind, leaving a living, breathing, empty shell. A man who, with a simple ice pick, destroyed thousands of personalities. Number 6. Dr. Walter Freeman. In the rogues gallery of medical history, we have seen doctors who kill for greed, for ideology, or for pure sadistic pleasure. Their evil is often defined by death. But there is another category of medical terror, a category that is perhaps even more chilling. It is not the doctor who kills the body, but the doctor who destroys the soul. This is the story of a man who waged a war, not on a disease, but on the human mind itself. He wasn't a back-alley butcher. He was one of the most celebrated and prominent physicians in America. And his weapon of choice was not a gun or a poison, but a simple, slender tool, no different from an ice pick. This is the story of Dr. Walter Jackson Freeman II, the father, the prophet, and the angel of death of the operation that would become a synonym for medical barbarism: the lobotomy. To understand how Walter Freeman could unleash such devastation, one must first understand the world he inhabited. The early 20th century was a dark age for mental health. Our great Gothic asylums were not places of healing. They were human warehouses. They were overflowing with the hopeless, the schizophrenics, the severely depressed, the hysterical housewives. Doctors had no real treatments. They had hydrotherapy, where patients were blasted with freezing water, and insulin coma therapy, where they were given overdoses to induce seizures. The medical profession was desperate for a cure, a magic bullet that could calm the agitated and empty the asylums. They were not looking for a gentle treatment. They were looking for a reset switch. Into this desperate world stepped Walter Freeman. He was not a fringe quack. He was medical royalty. His grandfather was a famous surgeon, and his father was a prominent pathologist. Freeman was a brilliant, ambitious, and charismatic neurologist at George Washington University. But he was frustrated by the impotence of his field. He wanted to cure the incurable. In 1935, he learned of a Portuguese neurologist, Egas Moniz, who had performed a leucotomy, drilling holes in a patient's skull to destroy fibers in the frontal lobe. Freeman was electrified. He adopted the procedure, renamed it the lobotomy, and in 1936 performed his first one in the U.S. He was celebrated as a pioneer, but he was deeply frustrated. The procedure was messy, it required a skilled surgeon, and it was too slow. Freeman's vision was grander. He needed a method that was fast, cheap, and simple. He needed a method he could perform himself, anywhere, on anyone. One day he found his inspiration. In his kitchen, he was using an ice pick to chip a block of ice. He looked at the simple, strong, slender tool. He then went to his office and examined a human skull. He found the weak point. He realized he didn't need to drill. He could go in, right through the thin bone of the eye socket. In 1946, he performed his first transorbital lobotomy. The procedure was a brutal spectacle. He would render the patient unconscious with electroshock. Then he would take his ice pick, later a custom tool called an orbitoclast, place it at the top of the eye socket, and hammer it with a surgical mallet straight into the frontal lobe. He would then wiggle the pick back and forth, severing the neural fibers in a crude, sweeping motion. Then he would pull it out and do the exact same thing to the other eye. The entire procedure took less than 10 minutes. To Freeman, it was a wild success. The agitated patient was now placid and quiet. In reality, he had simply destroyed the part of their brain that made them them. He had created a human doll, a compliant, emotionless shell. This was his magic bullet. He was now untethered from the constraints of neurosurgery. He was a man with a hammer and a pick, and he saw the entire world as his block of ice. He began a relentless crusade, a one-man roadshow of psychiatric destruction. He bought a van, which he nicknamed the Lobotomobile, and drove it from asylum to asylum, a traveling executioner of the human soul. He was a showman. He would gather young residents and awestruck nurses, perform the procedure, and then, in an act of grotesque arrogance, he would often use both hands at the same time, hammering picks into both eye sockets at once. In one single day, he lobotomized 25 women. The ice pick lobotomy was not surgery. It was a blind, brutal, and stunningly imprecise act of butchery. The frontal lobes are the seat of human identity. They control our personality, our judgment, our empathy, our very sense of self. And Walter Freeman was destroying them, one patient at a time, with all the finesse of a man hammering a nail. The results were catastrophic. For every success, which Freeman defined as a patient who was now docile, there were dozens of unmitigated disasters. Patients were left in a persistent vegetative state. They lost the ability to speak, to walk, to feed themselves. They became the living dead, empty shells who would spend the rest of their lives staring blankly at a wall. And then there were the deaths. Freeman would often plunge the pick in too deep, severing major arteries. Patients would die on the table, bleeding out into their own skulls. His most famous and most tragic failure was that of Rosemary Kennedy, the 23-year-old sister of future President John F. Kennedy. Rosemary was not mentally ill. She was just high-spirited and rebellious. Her father, obsessed with his family's image, saw her as a liability and secretly turned to Freeman. The operation was a disaster. It left her with the mental capacity of a 2-year-old, incontinent and unable to speak. She was hidden away in an institution for the rest of her life, her existence erased by her family. This was the cure Freeman was selling. He performed it on an estimated 3,500 people, including 19 children. The end of his reign came not from a moral awakening, but from the invention of thorazine, the first effective antipsychotic drug. His procedure was rendered obsolete overnight. He was banned from hospitals, a relic of a barbaric age. But he never stopped. His final lobotomy was in 1967, on a woman named Helen Mortensen. He plunged the pick in too deep and killed her on the table. He died in 1972, defiant to the end, a man who believed he was a persecuted genius. He destroyed thousands of minds, driven by a medical hubris that makes him one of history's most terrifying figures. But while he was destroying minds for progress, other doctors were destroying bodies for something far simpler: cold, hard cash. Number 7. Dr. Jayant Patel. We have seen doctors who were sadists, doctors who were fanatics, and doctors who were butchers. Their evil was active and intentional. But there is another kind of medical monster, a type that is far more common, and in many ways far more insidious. This is the doctor who is not a sociopath, but is simply a fraud. A doctor whose incompetence is so profound, whose ego is so vast, that they leave a trail of death and destruction in their wake. This is the story of a man who, when he was finally exposed as a danger in one country, simply lied, packed his bags, and moved to another to continue his work. This is the story of Dr. Jayant Patel, the man who, on 2 different continents, earned the exact same terrifying nickname, Dr. Death. Jayant Patel was born in India and received his medical degree in 1974. His ambition led him to the United States, where he began his surgical residency. But from the very beginning, there were problems. In 1984, while working in New York, he was fined by state health officials for failing to examine patients before operating on them. It was a serious red flag, an early sign of a man who cut corners and ignored basic protocols. But it didn't stop him. He moved to Kaiser Permanente Hospital in Portland, Oregon, where he worked throughout the 1990s. It was here that his reputation as a rogue surgeon truly began. Colleagues and nurses grew increasingly alarmed. They described him as arrogant, dismissive of advice, and dangerously overconfident. He would perform complex, unnecessary surgeries that he was not qualified for. He would operate on patients who were too frail for surgery. When complications arose, he would often disappear, leaving his staff to manage the crisis. The internal complaints against him piled up. More than 45 official reports were filed by his own staff. The hospital's reviews found his practices substandard and a danger to patients. Finally, in 1998, Kaiser Permanente restricted his license. He was forbidden from performing certain complex surgeries, including operations on the liver and pancreas, without direct supervision. For any other surgeon, this would be a career-ending humiliation. For Jayant Patel, it was just an inconvenience. In 2000, facing mounting scrutiny, he resigned. The Oregon Board of Medical Examiners, in a review of his cases, found gross or repeated acts of negligence. But crucially, his license was not permanently revoked. He was still technically a doctor, and he was free to practice elsewhere, as long as he was willing to lie. So in 2003, Jayant Patel did just that. He reinvented himself. He moved across the world to the small city of Bundaberg in Queensland, Australia. He applied for a job as director of surgery at the Bundaberg Base Hospital. On his application, he simply omitted the part about his restrictions in Oregon. He lied. The Queensland Medical Board, desperate for doctors in a rural area, failed to perform a proper background check. They did not contact the medical board in Oregon. They hired him. To the people of Bundaberg, he was a highly qualified surgeon from America. To the hospital, he was the answer to their staffing crisis. In reality, they had just handed the keys to the operating room to a man who would soon be known once again as Dr. Death. At Bundaberg, Patel was no longer just one of many surgeons. He was the director of surgery. He had power. He had authority. And he operated with a recklessness that stunned his new colleagues. The hospital's mortality rate began to skyrocket. Patients who walked in for simple procedures were being rolled out to the morgue. He performed operations he hadn't done in years, procedures he was explicitly banned from performing in the United States. He would remove organs that were perfectly healthy. He would stitch up wounds that were still bleeding internally. His diagnostic skills were, according to later reviews, non-existent. He once mistook a benign cyst for a cancerous tumor and performed a massive, unnecessary operation that nearly killed the patient. One of his most tragic victims was Mervyn Morris, a 75-year-old man. Patel insisted on performing a complex surgery to remove part of his esophagus, despite the man's other health problems. During the operation, Patel made critical errors. Morris died a slow, agonizing death from the complications. In another case, he perforated a patient's colon during a routine colonoscopy, a basic procedure. The patient died of septic shock. He was linked to at least 87 deaths and hundreds of severe, life-altering injuries. The nurses at Bundaberg saw exactly what was happening. They were horrified. They tried to warn hospital management, just as the nurses in Oregon had. They called him the ET surgeon because he always went home when a patient started to crash. But hospital management, worried about a scandal, buried the complaints. They protected him. It was one nurse, Toni Hoffman, who finally broke the silence. She became a whistleblower, risking her career to smuggle out documents and contact a local member of parliament. In 2005, her information was leaked to the press. The story exploded. Dr. Death was on the front page of every newspaper in Australia. As the scandal erupted, Jayant Patel packed his bags, booked a one-way ticket, and fled back to the United States. He was eventually extradited back to Australia, and in 2010, he was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 7 years in prison. But in a stunning legal twist, his conviction was overturned on a technicality. After a series of new trials, he was ultimately convicted only of fraud. He was given a 2-year suspended sentence, and having already served time, walked free. He returned to the U.S., a man responsible for a trail of death yet unpunished for it. Patel's evil was one of incompetence and ego, a failure of the entire medical system. But while he was failing his patients, another doctor, in another part of the world, wasn't just failing her patients. She was creating them, turning healthy people into cancer victims for one reason: cold, hard cash. Number 8. Dr. Linda Hazzard. We have seen the evil of incompetence, the cold, systemic malice of doctors who failed their patients and fled. But there is another, perhaps older form of medical evil: the quack, the charlatan, the con artist who stands completely outside the bounds of legitimate science, armed with a single bizarre theory and a mesmerizing, cult-like charisma. This is the story of a doctor who didn't just fail her patients. She convinced them that starvation was a miracle cure, all while she bled them of their fortunes. In the pristine wilderness of Washington state, she built a monument to her madness, a place her victims would come to call Starvation Heights. This is the story of Dr. Linda Hazzard. Linda Laura Burfield was born in 1867. She was not, in any traditional sense, a doctor. She held no MD from any accredited university. She was a woman from Minnesota who found her way into medicine through a dark and questionable loophole. She moved to Washington state, which at the time had a licensing system so lax that it allowed practitioners of alternative medicine to be licensed without examination. Hazzard, who had studied osteopathy, was granted one of these licenses. She was now, in the eyes of the law, Dr. Linda Hazzard, and she was free to practice her unique and deadly theories on the public. And her theories were indeed unique. Hazzard had a single, all-encompassing belief that all disease, from a common cold to a cancerous tumor, was caused by one thing: impurities in the body, which came from an excess of food. According to her, the human body was being systematically poisoned by the very act of eating. The only way to cure oneself, therefore, was to stop completely. This was her miracle cure: prolonged, agonizing starvation. She believed that by denying the body all nourishment, the vital force would be freed to conduct a house cleaning, attacking the disease at its source and burning up the impurities. What she was describing, of course, was simply the body's natural response to starvation, consuming its own fat and then its own muscle in a desperate attempt to stay alive. To Hazzard, the physical torment of this process, the dizziness, the nausea, the agonizing hunger pains, the skeletal emaciation, was not a side effect. It was the proof that the cure was working. The sicker her patients became, the more she assured them that the toxins were being violently expelled. But the starvation was only the first part of the torture. Hazzard's regimen was a carefully orchestrated descent into hell. Patients were fed nothing but a few cups of thin, strained vegetable broth a day, sometimes just asparagus or tomato broth. This was not enough to sustain a child, let alone an adult. To hasten the cleansing, Hazzard subjected her patients to a brutal daily routine. They were forced to endure enemas lasting 4 to 6 hours, where scalding hot water was pumped into their bodies, often causing internal burns. They were also subjected to massages, which were described by survivors as nothing less than ritualistic beatings. Hazzard, a strong and remorseless woman, would pound on her patients' backs and chests, believing she was beating the disease out of them. As the weeks turned into a month, the patients would, naturally, begin to waste away, their weight plummeting to 70, 60, or even 50 pounds. And as their bodies withered, their minds followed. This was the moment the true motive of her cure was revealed. This was not about health, it was about theft. As her patients lay on their deathbeds, delirious from hunger, trapped in their isolated rooms, and completely under her charismatic spell, Dr. Hazzard or her husband, Samuel, a convicted bigamist, would appear at their bedside with a stack of legal documents. She would explain that they were too weak to manage their earthly affairs, that they needed to focus on their healing. She would have them sign over power of attorney. She would have them sign new wills. She would have them transfer their bank accounts and stock portfolios directly to her. She would even remove the jewelry from their emaciated bodies. And then, when she had secured every last penny, she would let them die. She would then sign the death certificate herself, listing the cause of death not as starvation, but as cirrhosis of the liver, or stomach cancer, or whatever underlying disease she claimed they had come to her to cure. For years, Hazzard operated her Starvation Heights sanitarium with shocking impunity. Dozens of people entered her care and were carried out in coffins, their estates mysteriously lighter, their bank accounts mysteriously empty. She had become a serial killer disguised as a health guru. But in 1911, her greed and her hubris would finally push her one step too far. Her new victims were Claire and Dorothea Daisy Williamson, two wealthy British heiresses who were obsessed with health fads. They checked themselves into Hazzard's Institute. The treatment began. Claire, the sicker of the two, died after just 50 days, her body weighing less than 70 pounds. Hazzard, now in control of her will, had her body autopsied by a crony and immediately embalmed, destroying the evidence. She then set her sights on Daisy. But the sisters had made one crucial mistake in Hazzard's plan. They had told their childhood nurse, Margaret Convey, where they were going. When Convey, who was in Australia, stopped receiving letters, she grew suspicious. She boarded a ship and began the long journey to Washington State. She arrived at Starvation Heights and was told Claire was dead. She demanded to see Daisy. Hazzard refused. Convey forced her way past Hazzard and found Daisy, not as a healthy heiress, but as a living skeleton. weighing less than 50 pounds. Delirious, but still, terrifyingly. Defending Dr. Hazzard. Convey knew she was in a race against time. Hazzard was now legally Daisy's guardian and refused to let her leave. Convey had to physically kidnap Daisy from the sanitarium, smuggling her out in the dead of night to get her to a real hospital. With a living witness, the authorities finally acted. Hazzard was arrested. The 1912 trial was a global sensation. The press dubbed her the Starvation Doctor. Hazzard, arrogant as ever, claimed she was a medical pioneer being persecuted by jealous male doctors. But the jury, faced with the skeletal, frail but articulate testimony of Daisy Williamson, saw the truth. They found Dr. Linda Hazzard guilty of manslaughter and sentenced her to 2 to 20 years of hard labor. Starvation Heights was finally closed. It seemed like justice was served, but it wasn't. In a stunning failure of the justice system, Hazzard was granted a full pardon by the governor after serving just 2 years. She was released, and in an act of supreme arrogance, she returned to Olalla and built a new sanitarium, continuing her work. Her final justice would be poetic. In 1938, she fell ill, and, a true believer in her own con, she began a fast to cure herself. She died, just as her victims had. She starved to death. Hazzard's evil was a con, using starvation to steal fortunes. But our next doctor's con was far more sinister. She didn't just steal fortunes. She stole her patients' health, convincing healthy people they were dying of cancer, just to get rich. Number 9. Dr. Farah Fatteh. We have journeyed through the darkest corners of medical history, witnessing doctors driven by fanaticism, sadism, incompetence, and outright quackery. Their motivations were often complex, rooted in twisted ideologies or profound character flaws. But sometimes, the most chilling evil is the simplest. It is the evil born not of madness or delusion, but of pure, unadulterated greed. This is the story of a doctor who didn't just fail her patients. She actively hunted them, turning the terrifying diagnosis of cancer into a personal gold mine. She didn't use an ice pick or a gas chamber. Her weapon was a chemotherapy drip, poisoning hundreds of healthy people for profit. This is the story of Dr. Farah Fatteh, the oncologist who built an empire on a foundation of lies and toxic chemicals. Before she became one of the most infamous criminals in the history of American medicine, Dr. Farah Fatteh was a pillar of the Detroit, Michigan medical community. Highly educated, board-certified in hematology and oncology, she built a sprawling, successful practice across the affluent suburbs. She was prominent, respected, a wife, a mother, and a multimillionaire. The embodiment of success. Patients saw a confident, authoritative physician. When she delivered the devastating diagnosis of cancer, they believed her without question. When she prescribed aggressive chemotherapy, they saw her as their only hope against a terrifying disease. They placed their lives in her hands, unaware they were entrusting themselves to a predator whose only concern was her bottom line. What could possibly motivate a doctor to commit such a betrayal? The reality behind Dr. Fatteh's gleaming practice was a nightmare of staggering proportions. She was running a sophisticated and deeply evil scam. Her business model was brutally simple. Diagnose as many patients as possible with cancer, whether they had it or not, and then bill their insurance companies for the most expensive treatments imaginable, primarily chemotherapy administered in her own clinics. She was a master manipulator. She would tell perfectly healthy people they had rare, aggressive blood cancers requiring immediate, lifelong treatment. She would tell cancer survivors, stable for years, that their disease had returned with a vengeance. She would lie to the families of terminally ill patients, offering false hope while subjecting their dying loved ones to brutal, pointless rounds of chemo, maximizing profits until their very last breath. The human cost was catastrophic. Chemotherapy is a poison, designed to kill fast-growing cells. In healthy people, it is nothing but a poison. Fatteh's victims endured the full horror of its side effects: hair loss, uncontrollable nausea, destroyed immune systems, kidney and liver damage, brittle bones, rotting teeth, and permanent agonizing nerve pain. They lost their jobs, drained their savings, and watched their bodies break down, all for a disease they never had. Robert Sobire was told he had a rare blood cancer and would die without her. For over 2 years he suffered relentless chemo, losing his teeth, his job, and his health, preparing for a death that wasn't coming from cancer, but potentially from the cure itself. Monica Flagg was told her cancer had returned. Fatteh's massive chemo doses weakened her legs so severely they snapped under her own weight. She would never walk normally again. Fatteh even administered chemo to patients on their deathbeds, causing needless suffering for a final payout. She wasn't treating patients. She was harvesting them. How did she get away with it for so long? For years, Dr. Fatteh operated with impunity, protected by her reputation and the complexity of medical billing. But her insatiable greed made her sloppy. The sheer volume of patients and the astronomical sums she billed began to raise red flags. The person who finally blew the whistle wasn't a doctor, but her practice manager, George Karadžić. He noticed impossibly long treatment durations, bills for dead patients, and drug orders exceeding any other oncologist in Michigan. Quietly, terrified but resolute, Karadžić began copying records, gathering evidence of a crime almost too evil to comprehend. He contacted the FBI. The federal investigation uncovered a fraud so vast and depraved it stunned seasoned agents. Fatteh had amassed over $34 million through fraudulent billing. Experts reviewing the files saw case after case of misdiagnosed or entirely fabricated cancers treated with toxic, unnecessary drugs. She had administered over 9,000 needless injections and infusions. In August 2013, agents arrested Dr. Fatteh at her multi-million-dollar mansion. The community was shocked. Patients initially defended her, but as the horrifying details emerged, their gratitude turned to sickening realization. Their suffering had been a lie, manufactured for profit. At her trial, victims filled the courtroom, many in wheelchairs, their bodies permanently damaged. One by one, they shared their harrowing stories. Faced with overwhelming evidence and over 500 victims, Fatteh pleaded guilty in 2014 to healthcare fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. At her sentencing, Judge Paul Borman called her crimes huge, horrific, and unparalleled. He sentenced her to 45 years in federal prison, ensuring she would die behind bars. Dr. Fatteh exploited the deepest human fear, the fear of cancer, and twisted it into a business model. She didn't use arcane methods or operate in the shadows. She used the tools of modern medicine, poisoning patients for profit within the system itself. Her evil was born of simple greed, but our final doctor's evil was born of something else entirely. A lie dressed up as science, a fraud that unleashed plagues upon the world. Number 10. Dr. Andrew Wakefield. We have journeyed through a landscape of medical horrors, from the gas chambers of Auschwitz to the filthy clinics of Philadelphia, from the butchered minds left by the ice-pick lobotomy to the poisoned bodies left by a greedy oncologist. The doctors we've encountered used scalpels, needles, starvation, and even the machinery of war to inflict suffering. But our final story involves a doctor whose weapon was far more subtle, yet whose impact may have been the most devastating of all. He didn't kill with his hands. He killed with his words. This is the story of a respected physician who, through a single catastrophic act of fraud, unleashed plagues upon the modern world, convincing millions to fear the very science designed to protect their children. This is the story of Dr. Andrew Wakefield. Before he became the global face of the anti-vaccine movement, Andrew Wakefield was a respected British physician and researcher at London's prestigious Royal Free Hospital. In the mid-1990s, the world was gripped by a terrifying mystery. Autism diagnoses were skyrocketing, and desperate parents were searching for answers. Wakefield, a gastroenterologist, was approached by a lawyer representing parents who believed the measles, mumps, and rubella (MMR) vaccine had damaged their children. Wakefield was hired, paid over £50,000, specifically to find a scientific link to support a lawsuit against vaccine manufacturers. This crucial fact, that his research was funded by lawyers with a predetermined goal, was hidden from the public and the medical community. Was his research truly objective, Or was the conclusion already bought and paid for? Wakefield studied just 12 children, most of whom were clients of the lawyer paying him. He claimed to have discovered a new syndrome linking bowel inflammation and autism, which he called autistic enterocolitis. He theorized that the MMR vaccine allowed the measles virus to linger in the gut, causing toxins to leak into the brain. In 1998, he and 12 colleagues published these findings in The Lancet, a top medical journal. The paper itself was small, uncontrolled, and explicitly stated it did not prove a link between MMR and autism, calling for more research. But Wakefield wasn't interested in caution. He wanted a revolution. At a press conference held by the hospital, Wakefield deliberately went rogue. Ignoring the limitations of his own paper, he told the world's media he could no longer support the use of the combined MMR vaccine. He recommended parents seek out single-dose vaccines instead. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. Headlines screamed about the dangers of MMR. Panic spread like wildfire. Parents, terrified for their children, began refusing the vaccine that had saved millions from deadly diseases. Vaccination rates in the UK plummeted, falling far below the level needed for herd immunity. But behind Wakefield's pronouncements lay another, darker secret. While attacking the standard MMR vaccine, he had filed patents for his own single-dose measles vaccine and diagnostic kits. He wasn't just a scientist raising concerns. He was an entrepreneur potentially creating a billion-dollar market built on fear. How far would this deception go? The global scientific community reacted swiftly. Dozens of large-scale independent studies involving millions of children were conducted across the world. The results were unanimous and overwhelming. There is absolutely no link between the MMR vaccine and autism. Wakefield's autistic enterocolitis was found not to exist. His theory was scientifically demolished. But Wakefield refused to accept the evidence. He dismissed the global consensus as a vast conspiracy by Big Pharma. He became a martyr for the anti-vaccine cause, his fame growing even as his scientific credibility evaporated. The real damage, however, was just beginning to surface, not in scientific journals but in hospital wards. Measles, a disease once nearly eradicated in the developed world, came roaring back. Outbreaks exploded across the UK, Europe, and the United States. Children began getting sick. They suffered pneumonia, encephalitis, permanent brain damage, and inevitably, children began to die, killed by a preventable disease their parents had been taught to fear by a doctor they trusted. While the human cost mounted, investigative journalist Brian Deere began digging into Wakefield's original Lancet paper. What he found was shocking. Wakefield hadn't just made a mistake. He had committed deliberate fraud. Deere discovered Wakefield had manipulated the data on nearly all of the 12 children, altering their medical histories to fit his theory. Children whose symptoms began before the vaccine were reported as developing them after. Children with known developmental issues were presented as previously healthy. Furthermore, Wakefield had subjected these vulnerable children to invasive, painful, and medically unnecessary procedures like colonoscopies and spinal taps, often without proper ethical approval. The exposure of the fraud led to a complete unraveling. 10 of Wakefield's co-authors retracted their support for the paper. The Lancet itself fully retracted the paper in 2010, calling it utterly false. The UK's General Medical Council, after the longest disciplinary hearing in its history, found Wakefield guilty of serious professional misconduct, dishonesty, and the abuse of developmentally challenged children. He was struck off the medical register, stripped of his license to practice medicine. But the virus he had unleashed, the virus of misinformation, could not be recalled. Wakefield moved to the United States, rebranding himself as a persecuted filmmaker and truth-teller. He continues to be a central figure in the anti-vaccine movement, his original lie still fueling outbreaks of preventable diseases around the world. Andrew Wakefield didn't use a weapon you can see. He used his authority as a doctor to poison the well of public trust, causing suffering on a global scale. A chilling reminder that sometimes the most dangerous doctors are not those who take a life, but those who spread a lie.